Damn, what an intro. Thanks, Yanni. Yeah, so like Yanni said, my name's Andy Richardson. I'm going to be talking about some forms today. I am a software engineer currently at GraphCDN. We do some pretty cool stuff with edge caching on GraphQL endpoints, so if you're into that kind of thing, definitely check it out. And yeah, you can find me online, search Andy Richardson. I'll probably pop up. Cool. My boss said that I didn't make a big enough statement about GraphCDN, so there you go, Max. If you want to find out more as well, he actually did a talk earlier today, this morning, about GraphCDN and what we do, so definitely give that a peek. But without further ado, forms. So first thing I want you to do is just think about a good form experience. So we've all been on bad form experiences, very confusing, all over the place. But when we think about good form experiences, we probably think about a simple journey, a guided experience so we know where to go throughout the form, and also something that's responsive and fast to use. I think the worst case scenario is having to go back in a form because you've made a mistake early on. So if we put that into like an ideal flow, almost like a user journey, we're thinking about populating a field, getting told if you messed up, ideally as soon as possible, and then some kind of progression. And a progression can be moving to the next field, it can be the next page in the form if it's a multiple page form, or it could be the final progression, which is a submission. And this is what it looks like currently in React when we make forms, which is very, very different. Rather than having these progressive fields, which are the primary thing we think about. Instead, we have forms are the primary thing we think about, and we shove everything in a form early on. And it's kind of strange, because that's not what we really do with React. Usually, if we have things that happen over a series of pages or so on, we wouldn't put all that logic in one place. But with forms at the moment, we do. So this got me thinking, is there a way that we can make a form where we don't need to put the schema all in one place? We don't need to put the onSubmit statement all in one place. And what if we do that dynamically as we're moving forward, as the user's going through fields and so on? And yeah, so that's exactly what I wanted to try. And about a year and a half ago, I started a project called Fielder with the goal to try something like this. And I want to run you through the pieces and also show you some examples and see what you folks think. And the end goal isn't really to get people to use Fielder. It's just so that the next project I go on, I don't have to deal with terrible forms because you all have, I don't know, pushed forward a new library that fixes this problem. So yeah, this is a proposed solution, but whatever library applies it doesn't really matter too much. So the pieces. So if we want to create a great form, and we don't want to have to hoist everything to the top of the form, first thing we have is the form. But the big difference here is that this is very, very dumb. So this is just an amalgamation of state, and this will be high up in the component tree. And once we declare it, we forget about it. The next thing is the field, and this is our first-class citizen. So here we mount the field, we give it some validation, we give it an initial value, and that's basically how we design our forms with fields, as opposed to with just one big form. And then finally, we've got progression. And you might think of this as an onSubmit, and it is definitely an onSubmit. But it can also be a onProgress. So if you think about a wizard, if any of you are familiar with that, a form where you've got multiple pages and you're stepping through, we usually want to guard that just as much as we want to guard that final submit statement. Because there's nothing worse, like we said, than having to go back in a form and fix something somewhere else. So we want to guard that and prevent progression from happening. So yeah, there's an example, but also we can also have like some kind of progression which isn't a submit. Cool. All right, I'm going to show you some examples. So we'll get hands-on with code, and let's see what we can make with those three things. So first off, hopefully you can see this. Yes. Big enough. So we've got a username field, and we want to populate it with a value. And if the user changes that field or tries to submit and there isn't any value there, we want to show some kind of error. So presentational components out the way, that's a completely different talk. The first thing we're going to do, declare our field, pretty straightforward. And then we add our validation. And in this case, because we don't care about the particular event that we're validating on, we're just going to check the value, and if it's not there, we throw an error. And then, as you can see further down, we present that error when it occurs. And then finally, we just want to guard that, so we want to make sure that that validation is satisfied before we allow any kind of submission. Cool. So now let's mix it up a bit. Let's take what we have already, and let's add in some async validation. So sometimes this can be quite tricky. I think with Formic, you would have to do an onSubmit, which checks, does async validation, and then write your own errors or something like that. But in our case, this is the only change. So because everything is located with a field, the field just gets told, hey, there's a submit event, and the validation function gets called. And then we just go, OK, well, if it's a submit validation, let's return a promise, which checks if the username is taken. If it is, then we throw an error. If not, we return, and then the handle submit call will continue and submit. And then, yeah, in this case as well, the only difference now is we just want to show that we're checking that username is taken. So those are two still fairly basic examples, and they don't really demonstrate why having things coupled to fields as opposed to forms are really valuable. I think branching is when that starts to change. If you've ever tried to do a form, which is technically more than one form, and you need to split depending on user values, you've probably gotten really frustrated with most form libraries. And that's because we're expected to hoist all that conditional logic up into the form when we declare the form. But then we also have that conditional logic in our routing as well. And it becomes a bit of a mess and very hard to maintain. So this first example of a form, the user provides a region, and then if they choose the UK, they get asked to put in their favorite tea. If it is if they hit the US, then they get asked to put in their favorite coffee. So now let's look at an example of that. First, we're just going to make that little micro component that does the region selection. Nothing too exciting. We've got a field that takes region, and we populate the value. And then we're going to call an onComplete. Don't worry about that for now. We'll come back to that, but that's just some kind of thing to move forward onto the next step of the form. Now, in our UK form, because we only want to validate if we take that branched route, we don't need to worry about hoisting it and then doing lots of conditional logic. Instead, we just mount our fields and add our validation. And similarly, with the US form, the exact same thing. And the cool thing about this is that because we're doing our validation at render time and our submit at render time when we're going down that route as opposed to prematurely, we don't really need to add any conditional logic, because if we take the UK form route, then we're never going to render that field anyway, so the validation won't apply. So it's a lot more straightforward. And the final step is now just having that root component that just composites this. So handles rendering those different steps and then ordering them in the way that's necessary. So you can see here we render our region select on the first step. That will then call onComplete. And then we move to the second step. And this is where we start doing our branching. And this is the only branching we do. So if you think about that initial example with Formic, you've got your onSubmit, which will have to branch if you're changing different endpoints to call. And also with your validation, you'll also have to have that conditional logic in your validation. And then when you render, you'll also have to do that branching logic again. Because we're handling submission and validation low in the DOM, in the component tree, we don't really need to branch anywhere other than when we're rendering. So yeah, and that's kind of the secret, really. I think that this is one of those things that would have made things a lot easier. And I think it's just we've gone, as a community, down this route of having forms as this big entity. And I think that maybe it could be a lot simpler if we treat them as more dynamic. So you can basically forget about this, and you can forget about this, all this branching on schemas and on submits, and instead you can just branch when you're rendering and just declare validation as you would if you weren't branching. So yeah, that's about it, really. If there was a summarization for this, it's not necessarily checkout fielder, although I definitely recommend it if you think this is interesting. But it's more so that let's see if we can get forms going more through this direction, because I think it has a lot of potential. Thanks.